The husband claimed that the child was not theirs and demanded a DNA test. But when the results came back, the truth shocked everyone. Watch until the end to find out what his family was hiding. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Emily woke up before dawn, her body cold from the restless sleep that barely held her through the night. She lay there for a moment, the ceiling above her a pale canvas slowly shifting to gray as the morning light crept into the room. She turned her head toward the calendar pinned next to the mirror, days marked in small red circles, numbers crossed out with the tidy precision of someone who needed to feel in control of something, anything, even if it was just days on paper. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Mark, who was sprawled across his side, breathing heavily, his hair sticking out in every direction, the way it always did when he was truly exhausted. She walked to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale, with dark shadows under her eyes, reminders of the restless nights she had spent replaying memories she wished she could erase. Memories of blood, of pain that felt like something tearing from the inside, of the cold, bright lights of the hospital room and the hush that fell over the nurses when the monitor flatlined. The memory of the doctor placing a hand on her shoulder, telling her softly that sometimes these things just happened, that it wasn't her fault, even though it felt like it was. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath before reaching for the small bottle of pills lined up like soldiers on the counter, swallowing them dry. Mark had tried to help, she knew that. He had been there after the first miscarriage, holding her while she cried into his chest, telling her it was going to be okay, that they would try again, that they would get through it together. But even he had begun to falter after the second time, his reassurance thinning into silence, his comforting words turning into practical reminders about doctor's appointments and finances. The warmth in his eyes replaced with worry lines that deepened each month as they marked another cycle, another negative test. She walked back into the bedroom, pulling on the thick sweater that had started to fray at the cuffs, her jeans fitting a little tighter around her waist than they used to. She moved quietly around the room, picking up Mark's socks from the floor, folding the throw blanket back over the chair, creating a small sense of order in a world that felt increasingly out of her control. She heard Mark stir, his groggy voice breaking the silence as he mumbled her name, asking her to come back to bed. She paused, her hand on the back of the chair, before turning to him with a soft smile, climbing back into the warmth of the covers, letting him wrap his arm around her, pressing his forehead against the back of her neck. They didn't talk about it that morning, the appointment they had later that day at the fertility clinic. They didn't talk about how much it was costing them, the way their savings were draining away into the sterile white rooms, into vials and charts and doctors who spoke in probabilities and percentages that sounded like hope, but felt like the echo of a clock ticking down. Instead, they lay there in silence, letting the minutes pass, holding on to the illusion that for a few moments nothing was wrong, and they were just a couple enjoying a lazy morning in bed. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and the faint trace of lavender from the air fresheners plugged into the walls, a pathetic attempt to soften the sharpness of what the place represented. Women sat in the waiting area, some with partners, some alone, all with the same look in their eyes, a mixture of hope and exhaustion, a quiet desperation they tried to hide behind their phones or magazines they pretended to read. Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of her wedding ring, her eyes focused on the floor tiles, counting the patterns to distract herself from the pounding in her chest. Mark sat beside her, tapping his foot lightly, his hand resting on her knee, the pressure of it reassuring but also a reminder of the weight they both carried into that room. When the nurse called their names, they stood up together, walking down the hallway toward the small consultation room, the walls lined with framed photos of smiling babies, success stories that were meant to inspire but felt like accusations to Emily, each one a reminder of what she didn't have yet. The doctor explained the procedure, the medications Emily would need to take, the schedule they would need to follow, the injections Mark would have to learn to give her at home. Emily nodded, taking the information in, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones, the fear mixing with hope in a cocktail that made her stomach churn. Mark tried to lighten the mood, making a joke about his fear of needles, earning a polite laugh from the nurse, but Emily could see the tension in his jaw, the way he clenched his teeth after he smiled. At home, the routine became their life. The medication schedules, the injections that Mark learned to administer, his hands trembling the first few times before they both grew used to the small pinch, the sting that faded quickly but left a bruise on her skin, a constellation of purple and yellow marks that she traced with her fingers in the shower, a reminder of what they were fighting for. They stopped making plans for vacations, stopped going out to dinners, every extra dollar saved for the next appointment, the next procedure, the next hope. Emily stopped letting herself look at baby clothes in the store, stopped letting herself imagine what it would be like to decorate a nursery, to hold a child that was hers, really hers. It was easier that way, she told herself, easier not to get too attached to a possibility that might never come true. But at night, when she lay awake beside Mark, listening to his breathing, she would place her hand on her belly, closing her eyes, letting herself imagine just for a moment what it would feel like to know there was life growing inside her, to know that she was not broken, that her body could do what it was meant to do. When the test came back positive, she didn't believe it at first. She had waited 3 days after her missed period, too afraid to take the test, too afraid of the single line that would confirm her fears again. But on the 3rd day, she couldn't wait any longer, taking the test into the bathroom in the early hours of the morning, sitting on the edge of the tub while she waited, the seconds dragging out like hours. When she saw the 2 lines, clear and undeniable, her breath caught in her throat, tears welling in her eyes as she pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from waking Mark with the sob that threatened to break free. She hid the test in the drawer, unsure of how to tell him, wanting to hold on to the secret for just a little while, to let herself feel the joy before the fear came back. But when Mark found the test later that morning, rummaging in the drawer for toothpaste, his eyes widened, looking from the test to her, the toothbrush dropping from his hand into the sink with a clatter. They both laughed then, tears mixing with the toothpaste still foaming in their mouths, holding each other in the cramped bathroom, letting themselves believe, just for that moment, that everything was going to be okay. The pregnancy was not easy. Emily was sick almost every morning, the nausea so intense she would curl up on the bathroom floor, the cool tiles against her cheek the only relief she could find. She felt every cramp, every twinge of pain, with a fear that settled deep in her chest, each doctor's appointment a gauntlet she had to pass, holding her breath until the ultrasound showed the flicker of a heartbeat, the steady thump that was too fast to be her own, a reminder that there was life inside her, a tiny, defiant heartbeat that seemed to say, "I'm here. I'm staying." Mark tried to be there, but work pulled him away, and she found herself going to appointments alone more often than not, sitting in the waiting room with her hands on her belly, watching other women with their partners, feeling the absence beside her like a shadow. She didn't blame him, not really, but it hurt. the loneliness creeping in even as she tried to focus on the baby, on the small victories of each week that passed without incident. As the due date approached, Emily allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe this time it would be different, that maybe this time she would get to hold her child in her arms, to bring her home, to be the mother she had dreamed of being. She started to let herself imagine the nursery, the soft blankets, the way it would feel to rock her baby to sleep, the weight of her in her arms, the smell of her hair, the warmth of her small body pressed against her chest. When the contractions started, Emily was ready, or as ready as she could be. The pain was sharp, taking her breath away, but she welcomed it, each wave a sign that her baby was coming, that she was strong enough to bring her into the world. The hours passed slowly, the pain intensifying, Mark's hand gripping hers as she breathed through the contractions, the nurses moving around her, adjusting monitors, checking her progress, their voices calm but firm. 17 hours. That was how long it took before she heard the cry, sharp and loud, cutting through the fog of exhaustion and pain, pulling her back into the room, back into her body, back into the moment she had waited for. They placed the baby on her chest, a tiny, squirming bundle with dark, curly hair and skin that was a shade deeper than Emily's, her eyes opening just for a moment, wide and bright, looking up at her mother with a seriousness that took Emily's breath away. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not the fear, not the doubt, not the long road that had brought them here. It was just Emily and her daughter, the warmth of her tiny body against her skin, the smell of her hair, the way her small hand curled around Emily's finger, holding on with a strength that made Emily's heart ache with love. She looked up at Mark, who was crying, his hand brushed against the baby's head, whispering softly, "She's here. You did it. She's perfect." Emily closed her eyes, letting the tears fall, her hand resting on her daughter's back, feeling the rise and fall of her small breaths, the steady beat of her heart, the promise of everything that was to come. In that moment, she let herself believe that they had made it, that they were finally a family, that the pain and the struggle had been worth it for this, for her, for the small miracle that was now asleep on her chest, safe and warm and loved. The first morning home was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, the baby asleep in the bassinet beside her, the soft puff of her tiny breaths rising and falling like the tide, the small fist curled under her chin. Mark was downstairs, trying to tidy up the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and the hum of the fridge filling the empty spaces that words should have occupied. Emily watched the morning light spill across the room, touching the edges of the bassinet, catching in the dark curls that covered the baby's head, those perfect, delicate curls that she could not stop staring at. When she reached down to lift the baby, she felt the soreness in her body, the ache that had settled deep in her bones from the hours of labor, from the months of carrying, from the years of hoping. She ignored it, pulling the baby close, feeling the warm weight of her daughter against her chest, breathing in the scent of her hair, a scent that was already so familiar it felt like it was part of her. She traced the curve of her daughter's cheek with her thumb, the soft skin a reminder of everything they had fought for, everything they had almost lost. The doorbell rang, and Emily flinched, clutching the baby a little tighter before standing slowly, moving carefully toward the stairs. She could hear Mark's voice, low and strained, greeting whoever was at the door, and then the sound of another voice, sharp and controlled, a voice that made Emily's stomach tighten even before she saw her. Susan, Mark's mother. She was here, unannounced as she often was, carrying with her the scent of strong perfume and the cold presence that seemed to fill every room she entered. Emily paused at the bottom of the stairs, holding the baby close, watching as Susan stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the living room, taking in the clutter of baby blankets, the bottles drying on the counter, the small signs of a life that had just begun to unfold within these walls. Susan's gaze moved to Emily, pausing for a moment before flicking down to the baby, her eyes narrowing just slightly, so quick that Emily almost missed it, but not quick enough to erase the sharpness in that glance. "Oh, she's here," Susan said, her voice too bright, too tight, as she stepped forward, reaching out a hand as if she expected Emily to simply hand the baby over. Emily hesitated just for a moment before shifting the baby in her arms, allowing Susan to look but not to take. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh, her dark lashes fluttering against her cheeks as she settled back into sleep, unaware of the tension crackling around her. Susan tilted her head, studying the baby with a critical eye, her lips pursing as she leaned closer. "She's beautiful," she said finally, but there was something in the way she said it, something that made Emily's chest tighten, something that felt like a question disguised as a compliment. Emily forced a smile, nodding, rocking the baby gently, her thumb rubbing small circles on the blanket as she tried to steady the pounding of her heart. Mark stepped closer, placing a hand on Emily's back, a gesture meant to be comforting, but it felt more like a reminder that they were not alone, that they were being watched, measured, evaluated. Susan's eyes moved to Mark, softening just slightly as she reached out to touch his arm, her fingers lingering for a moment before she pulled back, her gaze returning to the baby. "She doesn't look much like you did as a baby," Susan remarked, her tone casual, as if she were simply noting the weather, but Emily felt the words land like a stone in her stomach. Emily's smile faltered, and Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his mother before looking back at Emily, his eyes searching hers for something, though she wasn't sure what. "She's only a few days old," Mark said, his voice careful, measured, the way it always was when he spoke to his mother, as if he were walking a tightrope he couldn't afford to fall from. "Babies change so much in the first few weeks." Susan hummed, nodding slowly, but her eyes didn't leave the baby, tracing the curve of her cheek, the shape of her nose, the dark curls that framed her face. Emily felt exposed under that gaze, like every part of her daughter, was being scrutinized, judged, and found wanting. She wanted to pull the baby closer, to turn away, to shield her from the coldness in Susan's eyes, but she stood there, rooted to the spot, her fingers tightening around the baby's small body. The visit was short, but it felt like it lasted forever. Susan talked about the weather, about the neighbors, about a sale at the grocery store, her words flowing around them like water, meaningless and constant, filling the silence with noise that only made the tension more pronounced. Emily nodded and smiled when appropriate, her mind elsewhere, focused on the small warmth in her arms, the steady rhythm of her daughter's breathing, the soft weight of her that was the only thing keeping Emily grounded. When Susan finally left, the door closing behind her with a soft click, the silence that followed was deafening. Mark let out a breath he had been holding, running a hand through his hair as he looked at Emily, his eyes tired, apologetic. Emily didn't say anything, turning away to head upstairs, needing the safety of their room, the comfort of the quiet, the small world she had created around her daughter. She laid the baby in the bassinet, watching as she shifted slightly, her tiny hand curling around the edge of the blanket, her face peaceful in sleep. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the baby, trying to push away the echo of Susan's voice, the doubt that had slipped into the room like a cold draft. She knew it was foolish to let it get to her, to let the small, careless comments sink their claws into her. But they did, burrowing deep into the insecurities she thought she had buried, pulling them to the surface where they festered and grew. Mark came upstairs a few minutes later, pausing in the doorway, watching her with that same tired look, his eyes soft but distant, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. He crossed the room, sitting beside her, reaching for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. She doesn't mean anything by it," he said softly, but the words felt hollow, empty, floating between them like a ghost. Emily didn't respond, her eyes still on the baby, her mind replaying the way Susan had looked at her, the way she had looked at the baby, the way her words had dripped with something unspoken, something that felt like an accusation. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her, heavier than the exhaustion in her bones, heavier than the soreness that still ached in her body. She wanted to believe Mark, wanted to believe that it didn't matter, that Susan's words were just words, but deep down, she knew that it wasn't that simple. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and quiet days, the baby's cries filling the small hours of the morning, the soft hush of Emily's voice as she rocked her back to sleep, the gentle rhythm of the house adjusting to the presence of a new life. Mark went back to work, leaving early in the morning, returning late in the evening, his face drawn, his eyes tired, but always softening when he looked at the baby, when he kissed Emily's forehead before slipping into bed beside her. Visitors came and went, friends bringing meals, neighbors dropping off small gifts, their smiles warm, but their eyes lingering a little too long on the baby. The same look Emily had seen in Susan's eyes, the same unspoken question that hung in the air, heavy and silent. Emily smiled and thanked them, holding the baby close, shielding her from the weight of those looks, the quiet whispers that she could almost hear when they thought she wasn't listening. One afternoon, as Emily was folding laundry in the living room, the baby sleeping in her bassinet nearby, the doorbell rang again. She wiped her hands on her jeans, taking a deep breath before opening the door to find Susan standing there, her arms full of folded baby clothes, a tight smile on her face. "I found some of Mark's old baby clothes," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, placing the clothes on the couch, her eyes immediately going to the bassinet. "She's sleeping," Emily said softly, moving to stand beside the bassinet, her hand resting on the edge protectively. Susan hummed, nodding, stepping closer, her eyes scanning the baby, pausing on the dark curls, the soft brown skin that seemed to glow in the light streaming through the window. "You know," Susan began, her voice casual, her fingers playing with the edge of one of the tiny shirts she had brought, "it's interesting, isn't it, how babies can look so different from their parents, sometimes." Emily's stomach tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the bassinet, her eyes fixed on her daughter, refusing to look at Susan. "She looks like herself," Emily replied, her voice calm, steady, but she could feel her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. Susan didn't respond, her eyes lingering on the baby for a moment longer before she turned away, picking up the folded clothes, smoothing them out with careful hands. The conversation shifted after that, moving to mundane topics, but the weight of Susan's words hung in the air, a shadow that followed Emily even after Susan left, even after the door closed and the house was quiet again. Emily sat on the floor beside the bassinet, her hand reaching in to gently stroke her daughter's cheek, whispering softly, "You're perfect, just the way you are." The words trembling on her lips, a promise she made not just to her daughter, but to herself. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers didn't stop. They grew quieter, more careful, but they were still there, in the glances that lingered too long, in the questions disguised as casual remarks, in the way people looked at Emily, then at her daughter, then quickly away. Emily tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the small, quiet moments with her daughter, on the way she would grip Emily's finger with surprising strength, on the way her eyes would follow the light dancing on the walls, on the soft, contented sighs she made as she drifted off to sleep. But at night, when the house was dark and quiet, when Emily lay in bed, the baby sleeping in the bassinet beside her, she couldn't help but hear those whispers, couldn't help but feel the doubt creeping in, cold and sharp, burrowing into the spaces she had tried to fill with hope and love. She would reach over, placing her hand on her daughter's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall, the warmth of her small body, and she would remind herself over and over that this was real, that this was hers, that no one could take that away. Yet, even as she whispered those promises to herself in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would force her to prove what she already knew, something that would test the fragile peace she had fought so hard to create. She didn't know how or when, but she could feel it, like a storm on the horizon, a low rumble that promised to shake everything she had built, everything she was trying to hold together. And so, she waited, holding her daughter close, whispering words of love into the darkness, hoping that it would be enough, praying that it would be enough even as the first whispers grew louder, even as the storm drew nearer, even as the truth she knew in her bones prepared to collide with the doubts of those who could never understand what it meant to fight for something so small, so precious, so entirely hers. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow over the nursery where Emily sat in the rocking chair, the baby nestled in her arms, her tiny fist wrapped around Emily's finger with a grip that felt impossibly strong for something so small. Emily could hear the muffled sounds of Mark moving around in the kitchen downstairs, the low hum of the kettle boiling, the soft clink of mugs being set out on the counter, the quiet rhythms of a home trying to settle into the fragile normalcy of new parenthood. But even as she rocked her daughter gently, humming a soft tune that she barely remembered learning, there was a heaviness pressing against her chest, a weight that had nothing to do with the baby in her arms. Susan had started visiting more often, arriving unannounced, stepping into their home with the confidence of someone who believed the space was as much hers as it was theirs. She brought small gifts, clothes that had once belonged to Mark, toys she insisted would help the baby's development, books on parenting that she claimed she had found in the attic. She would place these offerings on the counter with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes before turning her attention to the baby, her gaze sharp and assessing, lingering on the dark curls, the warm tone of her skin, the shape of her eyes. Emily could feel the tension building each time Susan's eyes scanned over her daughter, as if she were cataloging every feature, every detail, comparing them against a standard that only she understood. There were no direct accusations, no words spoken aloud that could be used as evidence, but the air would thicken with the weight of what was left unsaid, the questions that hovered in the space between them, unspoken, but clear. Babies change so much in the first year, Susan would say, her tone light, but her eyes fixed on Emily's face, searching for a reaction. You never really know who they'll end up looking like. Emily would smile, nodding politely, clutching her daughter a little tighter, feeling the unspoken challenge in those words, the subtle insinuation that seeped into the walls of their home, into the quiet moments when Emily was alone with her daughter, staring into the small, curious eyes that watched her with complete trust. She tried to brush it off, to remind herself that she knew the truth, that nothing Susan said could change the bond she felt every time she held her baby close, every time she rocked her to sleep, every time she whispered promises into the soft curls at the crown of her head. But it was harder when Mark didn't say anything. He would stand beside Susan, nodding along with her comments, his eyes darting to Emily, filled with a softness that quickly turned to uncertainty when Susan's gaze shifted to him. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw would tighten when Susan made another comment, but he never spoke up, never told his mother to stop, never defended the family they were trying so hard to build. Instead, he would try to lighten the mood, making small jokes that fell flat, changing the subject, moving to the kitchen to make tea that no one really wanted. At night, when the baby was finally asleep, Emily would sit on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching Mark as he moved around the room, picking up stray blankets, folding laundry, anything to avoid meeting her eyes. She wanted to ask him why he didn't say anything, why he let Susan's words hang in the air like poison, why he didn't tell her that their daughter was perfect just as she was, that they didn't owe anyone explanations or justifications for the life they had created together. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy and bitter, and instead she would lie down beside him, turning her back to him as she closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, feeling the space between them grow wider with each passing day. Mark would reach out sometimes, his hand resting on her hip, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin. But even that felt like a question he was too afraid to ask, a comfort he wasn't sure he had the right to give. The pressure grew with each visit. Susan began bringing photo albums with her, placing them on the coffee table, flipping through the pages with a smile, pointing out pictures of Mark as a baby, his pale skin, his fine blonde hair, his blue eyes that looked nothing like the warm, dark eyes of the baby who now lay sleeping in the bassinet beside them. She would laugh softly, telling stories about Mark's childhood, her gaze flicking to the baby, her smile tightening, her fingers pausing on the images as if waiting for Emily to acknowledge the difference, to admit something she couldn't possibly admit because it wasn't true. Emily tried to push back, to reclaim the space that felt like it was slipping away from her with every comment, every glance. She would hold her daughter closer, would speak softly to her, would remind herself of the nights spent awake, feeling the baby's kicks, the way her body had changed and grown to carry this life, the way she had fought through every wave of pain, every fear that threatened to swallow her during the hours of labor, to bring her daughter safely into the world. But Susan's presence was like a shadow, following her through the house, lingering even after she had left, her words echoing in the quiet moments when Emily sat alone, feeding her daughter, rocking her back to sleep, the doubts creeping in despite everything she knew to be true. One afternoon, Susan arrived with a small bag in her hand, her expression serious as she stepped inside, her eyes flicking to Emily, then to Mark, who was sitting on the couch, bouncing the baby gently on his knee. "We need to talk," Susan said, her voice calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made Emily's stomach clench. She sat down across from them, placing the bag on the coffee table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been thinking," she began, her eyes fixed on Mark, And I believe it would be best for everyone if we did a DNA test." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, sinking into the room like a weight that pressed against Emily's chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. She looked at Mark, waiting for him to say something, to tell his mother that it wasn't necessary, that it was insulting, that it was cruel. But Mark's eyes dropped to the floor, his hand stilling on the baby's back, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. "Mom, I don't think," he started, but Susan held up a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't about accusations," she said, her voice smooth, her eyes shifting to Emily for a brief moment before returning to Mark. "It's about clarity. It's about protecting our family, about ensuring that we know the truth." Emily felt the room spin, her vision narrowing as she struggled to process the words, to understand how this was happening, how the woman who had never once offered her warmth or kindness could sit there, demanding proof of something that Emily had never doubted for a single moment. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell Susan no, to tell her to leave, to tell her that she had no right, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with the fear and the exhaustion and the deep, aching betrayal that was spreading through her chest. Mark looked up then, his eyes meeting Emily's, and in that moment, she saw it. The doubt. The small, flickering doubt that Susan had planted and nurtured with every visit, every comment, every photo album, until it had grown into something that he could no longer ignore, something that stood between them, casting a shadow over the love they had built, over the family they were trying so hard to protect. "Emily," he said softly, his voice trembling, "maybe it's not a bad idea just to clear things up." The words shattered something inside her, something fragile that she had been holding on to, something that had kept her steady through the long nights and the early mornings, through the fear and the exhaustion and the quiet moments of joy that came with being a mother. She felt it break, felt the pieces scatter, leaving her empty, hollow, and cold. She stood up, taking the baby from Mark's arms, holding her close as she turned away, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. "If you want a test," she said, her voice low, steady despite the storm raging inside her, "fine. But don't pretend this is for our family. Don't pretend this is about anything other than your mother's doubts and your willingness to let them matter more than the truth you already know." She walked out of the room, the baby's warm weight against her chest, the only thing grounding her as she moved down the hallway into the nursery, closing the door softly behind her. She stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself, trying to find the strength she needed to keep going, to keep fighting, to protect the small life that had become her entire world. She sat down in the rocking chair, the baby shifting slightly, letting out a small sigh before settling back into sleep, her tiny hand resting against Emily's chest, her soft breaths warm against Emily's skin. Emily looked down at her daughter, brushing a curl away from her forehead, her fingers trembling as she traced the curve of her cheek. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking as the tears finally fell, silent and hot against her skin. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, I will always be here." As she rocked her daughter to sleep, the quiet of the room surrounding them, Emily felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones, the understanding that this was only the beginning, that the fight was far from over, that the storm was coming, and she would have to be ready. She closed her eyes, holding her daughter close, letting the warmth and the small, steady heartbeat against her chest remind her of what mattered, of what was worth fighting for, of the truth she carried within her, unshakable and real, no matter what anyone else chose to believe. Emily stood by the window as the rain pattered softly against the glass, her daughter cradled in her arms, her small body warm and heavy against her chest. The nursery was dim, lit only by the gray light of a cloudy afternoon, and the rhythmic drumming of the rain was the only sound filling the silence that had settled over the house since that day. The day Susan had demanded a DNA test. The day Mark had looked at Emily with doubt in his eyes. The day the fragile trust she had fought to build cracked beneath the weight of words she could never unhear. She had not argued further when Mark said it might be a good idea. She had felt the fight leave her body, felt the exhaustion of months of pregnancy, years of trying, and the endless days and nights of new motherhood sink into her bones as she agreed, her voice quiet, steady but distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Mark had reached for her, his hands warm and trembling, trying to reassure her that it was just a formality, that it didn't mean anything, that it would only confirm what they already knew. But she had turned away from him, clutching her daughter tighter, letting the silence speak for her, letting him feel the distance he had created with his hesitation. The days since had moved slowly, each hour stretching into the next, the weight of what was coming pressing down on every moment. Emily went through the motions of caring for her daughter, feeding her, changing her, rocking her to sleep, the small routines grounding her even as her mind spun with what-ifs, with the echoes of Susan's words, with the memory of Mark's uncertain gaze. The baby, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her, would watch Emily with wide, curious eyes, her small hands reaching out, her soft coos and sighs filling the quiet spaces with reminders of why Emily would keep going, why she would not let this break her. Mark tried to pretend everything was normal. He would come home from work with flowers, with takeout from her favorite restaurant, with small attempts to bridge the gap between them. But Emily could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he watched her, waiting for her to say something, to let him in, to forgive him for doubting what she knew to be true. She would thank him, would offer a small smile, but the walls remained, solid and cold, built from the hurt that had taken root in her heart the moment he had chosen to let his mother's doubts overshadow the truth they had built together. The appointment was set for a Thursday morning. Emily dressed carefully, choosing a soft sweater and jeans that felt comfortable, her movements deliberate as she prepared the diaper bag, checking and rechecking the contents even though she knew everything was there. Mark hovered nearby, offering to help, but she shook her head, her silence filling the room, a barrier between them that he didn't know how to cross. They drove in silence, the baby asleep in her car seat, her small face peaceful, her hands curled into tiny fists against her chest. Emily kept her eyes on the road ahead, the gray clouds heavy above them, the city passing by in a blur of muted colors and wet streets. Mark glanced at her occasionally, opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the pressure. The clinic was cold, the air filled with the scent of antiseptic and the low hum of machines and quiet conversations. They sat in the waiting room, Emily holding the baby close, her eyes focused on the small face that watched her with trust and love, the only constant in a world that felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. Mark sat beside her, his knee bouncing nervously, his fingers tapping against the arm of the chair, the silence between them growing louder with each passing minute. When their names were called, Emily stood, adjusting the baby in her arms, walking toward the small room where the test would be done. The nurse was kind, her smile warm but professional as she explained the process, the gentle swab of the baby's cheek, the samples from Emily and Mark, the promise that it would be quick, that they would have their answers soon. Emily nodded, her movements calm, controlled, her mind a careful blank as she held her daughter, whispering softly to her as the nurse completed the test, telling her it would be okay, that she was safe, that nothing would change the truth of who she was. Mark went next, his eyes meeting Emily's as he sat in the chair, his mouth pulling into a small, strained smile that didn't reach his eyes. She looked away, focusing on the baby, on the small hand that grasped her finger, on the steady rhythm of her breathing, grounding herself in the moment, refusing to let the fear take over. When it was her turn, she sat in the chair, the swab brushing against the inside of her cheek, the sterile, clinical feel of it a stark reminder of what they were doing, of what they were trying to prove. When it was over, they returned to the car, the silence between them heavy, the air thick with unspoken words. Emily watched the city pass by through the window, the baby asleep in her seat, the soft rise and fall of her chest a small comfort against the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Mark reached for her hand as they pulled into the driveway, his fingers brushing against hers, but she pulled away gently, opening the door and stepping out, unbuckling the baby with careful hands, holding her close as she walked into the house, the door closing softly behind her. The days that followed were slow, each one marked by the waiting, by the constant awareness that the results were coming, that soon they would have the proof that Susan demanded, that Mark felt he needed. Emily moved through the days with quiet determination, caring for her daughter, filling the hours with small moments of peace, of love, of the quiet bond that grew stronger with each day. She would sit in the rocking chair, her daughter nestled against her chest, the soft hum of the lullaby she sang filling the room, the world outside fading away as she focused on the warmth of the small body in her arms, on the soft sighs and tiny smiles that reminded her of the truth she carried in her heart. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the baby's breathing, to the quiet creaks of the house settling around them, to the sound of Mark's breathing beside her, steady and quiet, a reminder of the distance that had grown between them. She would close her eyes, letting the darkness wash over her, letting herself feel the hurt, the anger, the betrayal, letting herself grieve for the trust that had been broken, for the innocence that had been lost, for the love that now felt tainted by doubt. And yet, beneath it all, there was a quiet resolve, a steady strength that refused to be broken. She knew the truth, knew it in the way her daughter looked at her, in the way her small hand curled around her finger, in the way her heart felt full every time she held her close. No test, no doubt, no demand from someone who had never truly seen her would ever change that. She would protect her daughter, would protect the truth of their bond, would fight for the family they had built, even if it meant standing alone. The call came on a Tuesday morning, the phone ringing in the quiet of the kitchen as Emily stood by the sink, the baby in her arms, her small head resting against Emily's shoulder. She answered, her voice calm, steady, as the nurse on the other end explained that the results were ready, that they could come in to receive them. Emily thanked her, hanging up the phone, standing there for a moment as the weight of what was coming settled over her, heavy and cold. Mark appeared in the doorway, his eyes searching hers, his mouth opening to speak, but Emily shook her head, turning away, walking past him to gather the diaper bag to prepare for what was to come. He followed her, his hands reaching for her, but she moved with quiet efficiency, her movements calm, controlled, her mind focused on what mattered, on the small, warm weight of her daughter in her arms, on the truth she would protect with everything she had. They drove in silence, the city passing by in a blur, the air thick with the tension of what was coming, the knowledge that soon the waiting would be over, that the truth would be laid bare, undeniable and clear. Emily held her daughter close, her eyes focused on the road ahead, her mind steady, her heart strong, ready to face whatever came next, ready to protect what was hers, ready to fight for the family she had built, for the love that no one could take from her. As they pulled into the parking lot of the clinic, Emily took a deep breath, looking down at her daughter, at the small, perfect face that watched her with trust and love, the only truth that mattered. She stepped out of the car, the air cool against her skin, the sky above gray and heavy, the promise of rain hanging in the air. Mark stepped beside her, his hand reaching for hers, but she held her daughter tighter, her eyes meeting his, steady and unflinching, before turning away, walking toward the doors of the clinic, ready to face the truth, ready to fight for the life she had brought into the world, ready to stand for the love that had carried her through the darkest nights, ready to protect it, no matter what the world tried to take from her. The clinic was too bright, the overhead lights sharp against the pale walls, reflecting in the glass frames of baby photos that lined the hallway, each smiling infant an echo of someone's relief, someone's victory, someone's proof that everything had been worth it. Emily sat with Luna in her lap, her small body warm and soft against the stiffness of Emily's posture, the baby's tiny hand clutching the edge of her mother's sweater as if she could feel the storm pressing around them. Mark sat beside them, his knee bouncing uncontrollably, the fabric of his jeans wearing thin where he rubbed his palm over it in restless circles, over and over, as though the friction might erase the tension clawing at the edges of the moment. The receptionist called their name, her voice cheerful in a way that felt intrusive, a bright note piercing the hush that had settled over the waiting room. Emily stood, adjusting Luna against her shoulder, her eyes meeting Mark's for a brief moment before looking away, stepping forward with quiet resolve, her movement steady despite the tremor in the air. The counselor met them at the door, a polite smile stretched too tightly across her face, the folder in her hand thick with papers, edges crisp, details printed in ink that would soon be recited, dissected, and remembered in the silence of their home long after today had ended. The room they entered was small, with 2 chairs set side by side and another across from them, a table between, a box of tissues placed neatly in the center like a silent promise of what was to come. Emily sat, her back straight, Luna now sleeping against her chest, her soft breath warm through the fabric of Emily's shirt, a steady rhythm grounding her against the hollow ache in her chest. Mark sat down heavily beside her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white, eyes fixed on the floor as though he could find the answers there, if only he stared hard enough. The counselor cleared her throat softly, opening the folder with careful hands, flipping through the pages until she found the one she needed, her eyes scanning the lines before she looked up, her smile gone, replaced by a calm seriousness that filled the room. "The results are back," she said, her voice even, professional, practiced in delivering truths that tore through people's lives like knives. "Luna is the biological daughter of both of you. There is no doubt." The words hung in the air, sharp and bright, cutting through the tension with a clarity that made Emily's eyes sting, though she did not cry. She held Luna a little tighter, her hand gently rubbing the baby's back, feeling the small body stir in her sleep, a soft sigh escaping the tiny lips that were so perfectly hers, so perfectly theirs. Mark let out a breath, his shoulders slumping as though a weight had been lifted, his hands unclasping as he turned to look at Emily, his eyes shining with relief that came too late, relief that could not erase the wound his doubt had carved into the space between them. Emily did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the counselor, waiting, sensing there was more, the way the woman's eyes flickered back to the papers, her lips pressing together before she spoke again. Her voice softer now, cautious, as though she were holding something fragile in her hands. However, she continued, and the word fell like a stone into the room, sending ripples through the calm that had barely settled. There was an unexpected result in the analysis of the parental markers. We discovered that there is no genetic match between Mark and the woman he believes to be his mother. The silence that followed was total. Mark's head jerked up, his eyes wide, his mouth opening but no sound coming out, his body frozen as though he had been struck. Emily felt Luna shift against her chest, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater, the only movement in a room that seemed to have stopped breathing. The counselor continued, her words measured, each one precise, each one falling into the space between them with the weight of something unchangeable, something final. We ran the tests multiple times to confirm. The markers show conclusively that there is no maternal link between Mark and his mother. We understand this is an unexpected finding, and we have resources available to help you navigate the implications of this information. Mark's breathing came in short, sharp gasps, his hands trembling as he pressed them to his face, dragging them down slowly, his eyes unfocused, lost, the world around him tilting as the foundation of who he was cracked beneath him. "No," he whispered, the word breaking as it left his lips. "No, that can't be right. She's my mother. I remember her holding me." Emily's eyes were on Mark now, watching him as he shattered, as the man she had known folded in on himself. The doubt he had once pointed at her now turned inward, consuming him with a viciousness that left her with a hollow ache in her chest, an ache that felt too much like pity. She thought of Susan, of the way she had stood in their living room demanding proof of Luna's place in their family, demanding that Emily justify the existence of the child she had carried, had birthed, had loved from the moment she had felt her first flutter of movement in the depths of her body. And now it was Susan's place in Mark's life that was being questioned. Susan's blood that was not flowing in the veins of the son she had raised. Susan's certainty that was crumbling in the sterile quiet of a clinic room that smelled of antiseptic and paper and the ghosts of truths people came here to find, never expecting the cost. Emily turned back to the counselor, her voice calm, clear, steady in a way that surprised her even now. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, her hand stroking Luna's back, her eyes steady, unblinking. The counselor explained gently, speaking of the possibility of a mix-up at the hospital, of adoption that had never been disclosed, of questions that might never have answers, of choices that would now need to be made about what to do with the knowledge they had been given. She offered contact information for support groups, for legal counsel, for therapy sessions that could help them process the grief, the loss of a truth they had believed in all their lives. Mark did not speak again as they left the clinic. He walked beside Emily, his steps slow, measured, as though each movement was an effort, each breath a reminder of the life he no longer recognized as his own. Emily held Luna close, her daughter's dark curls brushing against her cheek, the small warmth of her a lifeline as they stepped out into the gray light of the afternoon, The clouds heavy above them, the promise of rain hanging in the air like a question they could not yet answer. The car ride home was silent. Mark stared out the window, his reflection pale against the glass, his eyes empty, lost. Emily focused on Luna, on the small sounds she made in her sleep, on the rise and fall of her tiny chest, on the soft sighs that reminded her of the truth she knew, the truth that had been confirmed, the truth that no test could ever take from her. When they arrived home, Susan's car was already in the driveway. She was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp, waiting for the confirmation she believed she deserved, the vindication she was certain would be hers. Emily stepped out of the car, holding Luna close, her eyes meeting Susan's with a calm that felt like steel, the weight of the day pressing into the moment, into the space between the woman who had questioned her daughter's place in this family and the woman who had carried her, birthed her, and would protect her with everything she had. Mark stepped out of the car, his movements slow, his eyes on the ground as he walked toward his mother. Susan took a step forward, her mouth opening, but Mark lifted his hand, stopping her, his voice low, rough, breaking as he spoke. "It's not her. It was never her. You were wrong." Susan froze, her eyes narrowing, confusion flickering across her face before anger took its place. "What are you talking about, Mark? What did they say?" Mark looked up then, his eyes meeting his mother's, tears streaking down his face, his hands shaken as he gestured helplessly, the words tumbling out of him raw and broken. "They said, 'You're not my mother.' They said, 'There's no match, no blood, nothing.'" Susan's face drained of color, her mouth opening, closing, her hands reaching out as if to steady herself against a truth that she could not comprehend, that she could not fight. "That's impossible," she whispered, the words thin, brittle, breaking in the air. "I was there when you were born. I held you." Emily stood there, watching as the woman who had once stood so tall, so certain, so cold, crumbled under the weight of a truth she had demanded, a truth she had believed would condemn Emily, only to find it turning back on her, stripping away the certainty she had wielded like a weapon, leaving her exposed, lost, alone. Mark stepped back, his eyes closing, his shoulders shaking as he turned away, walking past Emily, past his mother, into the house without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Susan stood there, her hands trembling, her eyes wide and empty, staring at Emily as though she were seeing her for the first time, seeing the woman who had carried the child she had tried to deny, seeing the family that had been built not from blood, but from love, from truth, from the quiet strength that came from knowing who you were, even when the world tried to take that from you. Emily met Susan's gaze, her eyes steady, calm, unflinching. "She is ours," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet, the only sound beneath the heavy clouds that threatened to break open above them. "And nothing will change that." She turned, walking into the house, closing the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the silence, the rain beginning to fall in soft, steady drops, washing over the world outside as Emily stood in the quiet of her home, holding her daughter close, feeling the small, steady heartbeat against her chest, the truth of it grounding her, anchoring her to the life she had fought for, the life she would protect, the life that was hers no matter what blood, no matter what tests, no matter what doubts the world tried to cast upon it. She walked through the house, finding Mark in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a truth that had broken something inside him. Emily stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, Her daughter, stirring in her arms, letting out a soft cry that filled the room, a small, fragile sound that cut through the silence, reminding them both of the life they had created, the life they would protect, the life that was theirs. Mark looked up, his eyes red, his face pale, and for a moment there was only silence between them. The rain tapping softly against the windows, the quiet breathing of their daughter filling the room. The space between them no longer filled with doubt, but with something softer, something fragile, something that could perhaps become the beginning of healing. Emily shifted Luna into Mark's arms, watching as he held their daughter, his hands trembling as he cradled her close, his eyes closing as he pressed his cheek against her soft hair, breathing in the scent of her, the truth of her, the reality that no test could deny. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, the warmth of their daughter between them, a quiet promise that they would find their way through this together, no matter how broken the world around them had become. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world outside washed clean, the leaves dripping quietly in the soft breeze that moved through the neighborhood, the streets glistening under the pale light of dawn. Inside the house, the silence was thick, a quiet that was not peaceful but heavy, filled with the echoes of words that could not be taken back, of truths that could not be unseen, of the fractures that had splintered through the walls they had built around themselves. Emily sat in the nursery, the rocking chair creaking softly as she moved back and forth. Luna nestled in her arms, her small face pressed against her mother's chest, her breaths warm and even, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of Emily's shirt. The room was dim, the soft glow of the nightlight painting gentle shadows on the walls, the small mobile above the crib swaying slightly with the breeze that slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. Mark had not spoken much since the day at the clinic. He moved through the house like a ghost, his footsteps soft, his voice low when he spoke at all, his eyes distant, lost somewhere in the storm of thoughts that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He spent long hours in the nursery, sitting by Luna's crib, watching her sleep, his fingers brushing against her small hands, her tiny feet, his eyes wet with tears that he let fall only in the quiet, only in the darkness, only when he thought Emily was not watching. But she saw him. She saw the way he broke each day, the way the truth had shattered the foundation of who he thought he was, the way he struggled to find his place in a world that had tilted beneath him, leaving him unmoored, adrift in the uncertainty of a life that no longer felt like his own. She saw the way he looked at Luna, the way his eyes softened, the way his hands trembled when he held her, the way he pressed his lips to her soft hair, breathing in the scent of her, the reality of her, the truth that she was his, no matter what bloodlines, no matter what tests, no matter what Susan had believed. Susan had stopped calling. The phone that once rang with her demands, her questions, her cold, clipped comments now sat silent on the counter, a quiet that was almost deafening in its absence. Emily did not miss the sound of her voice, did not miss the way her presence filled the house with tension, with unspoken accusations, with the constant need to prove herself, to prove her daughter, to prove the family she had built. The silence left in Susan's wake was heavy, but it was also a space to breathe, a space to heal, a space to begin again. Emily moved through the days with quiet purpose, caring for Luna, filling the house with the soft sounds of lullabies, the gentle hum of her voice as she spoke to her daughter, telling her stories of the world, of the dreams she held for her, of the love that surrounded her, even in the quiet, even in the aftermath of the storm. She found comfort in the small routines, in the moments when Luna would open her eyes and smile, a small, toothless grin that lit up the room, chasing away the shadows, reminding Emily of why she fought, of why she stayed, of why she would never let the doubts of others steal the truth she held in her heart. At night, she would sit in the rocking chair, Luna asleep in her arms, the house quiet around them, the soft creaks of the floorboards, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic breathing of her daughter, all weaving together into a lullaby that soothed the ache that still lingered in her chest. She would close her eyes, letting the warmth of Luna's small body anchor her, letting the love she felt for her daughter fill the spaces that had been hollowed out by the harshness of the past weeks, letting herself believe that they would be okay, that they would find their way through this together. Mark would come to the doorway sometimes, standing there in the dim light, his silhouette framed by the glow of the hallway, his eyes watching them with a mixture of longing and fear, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as he struggled with the words he could not find, the apologies he did not know how to give, the love he felt but could not express through the wall of grief that stood between them. Emily would look up, their eyes meeting in the quiet, and for a moment the distance would close, the silence would soften, the hurt would ease, just for a breath, just for a heartbeat. One night he stepped into the room moving slowly, carefully, as though he were afraid of breaking the fragile peace that had settled over them. He knelt beside the rocking chair, his hands reaching out to touch Luna's small foot where it peeked out from the blanket, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the soft warmth of her skin. Emily watched him, her eyes soft, her heart aching with the love she still felt, the love that had been buried beneath the hurt, the love that was still there, waiting to be reclaimed. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered, his voice rough, broken, his eyes shining with tears that slipped down his cheeks, leaving tracks of salt in their wake. "I'm so sorry, Emily, for doubting you, for doubting her, for letting her do this to us." Emily looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her, heavy but honest, the truth of them ringing clear in the quiet of the room. She shifted Luna carefully, placing her in Mark's arms, watching as he cradled their daughter close, his tears falling onto the soft fabric of her blanket, his lips pressing against her forehead as he held her, as he let himself feel the truth of her, the reality of the love that bound them together, the family they had created, the family that was theirs, no matter what anyone else believed. Emily reached out, her hand resting on Mark's shoulder, her fingers squeezing gently, grounding him, anchoring him to the moment, to the truth they shared, to the love that had survived the storm. Mark looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no distance, no wall, no doubt, just the quiet, the love, the soft breath of their daughter between them, reminding them of who they were, of what they had, of what they could still build together. The days that followed were slow, filled with quiet healing, with small steps toward rebuilding the trust that had been broken, with gentle moments of laughter that slipped back into their home like sunlight through a cracked window, warm and welcome. Emily started to see glimpses of the man she had loved, the man who had held her hand through the hardest moments, the man who had once whispered dreams of a family into her hair as they lay together in the dark, the man who now held their daughter with a tenderness that made her breath catch, her heart ache with the beauty of it. She began to let him in again, piece by piece, moment by moment, letting the hurt wash away in the quiet, letting the love they shared take its place, letting herself believe that they could still find their way back to each other, that the cracks in their foundation could let the light in, that the silence after the storm could be the beginning of something new, something stronger, something real. Susan did not return. There was an email once, 3 paragraphs of apology, of explanations, of words that tried to mend what had been broken, but Emily did not reply. She read it, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of them pass through her. And then she let them go, letting the silence be her answer, letting the distance remain, letting herself choose peace over the constant battle for approval that had once defined her worth in that woman's eyes. She did not need Susan's approval. She did not need her forgiveness, her acceptance, her presence in their lives. She had her daughter, her family, her truth, and that was enough. That was everything. On a morning when the light was soft and golden, filtering through the leaves that danced in the breeze outside the nursery window, Emily sat with Luna in her lap, her small hands reaching up to touch her mother's face, her eyes bright and curious, her laughter bubbling up in soft giggles that filled the room with joy. Mark stood in the doorway, a mug of tea in his hands, watching them with a softness in his eyes that made Emily's heart swell, her breath catch, her love for him returning, quiet but sure, like a river finding its way back to the sea. She looked at him, smiling, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them, the past still there, but no longer defining them, no longer holding them back, no longer the weight they carried in every breath. They had survived the storm. They had found the quiet after the chaos. They had found each other again, in the silence, in the small, everyday moments that built their life, their family, their love. And in that quiet, in that gentle, golden light, Emily knew that they would be okay. They would grow, they would heal, they would build a future for their daughter, a future filled with love, with truth, with the quiet strength that comes from having faced the worst and come through it together, stronger, unbreakable, ready for whatever came next. Morning light stretched across the living room floor, soft and golden, catching on the edges of toys scattered like small bright islands on the rug, reflecting off the framed photos Emily had finally begun to hang again on the walls. Pictures of Luna's first smile, her tiny hand curled around Emily's finger, Mark holding her with a look of quiet wonder that had returned to his eyes. The house, once heavy with silence, had begun to breathe again, each day layered with the slow, steady routines of feeding, playing, rocking to sleep, each moment a quiet declaration that life, despite everything, was moving forward. Emily stood in the kitchen, the kettle steaming gently as she prepared tea. Luna perched on her hip, babbling softly, her small hands reaching for the spoon Emily stirred with, her eyes bright and curious, so full of life that it made Emily's breath catch in her chest. She pressed a kiss to the soft curls on her daughter's head, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the moment sink into her bones, a reminder of the promise she had made to herself, to her daughter, to protect this life, to protect this peace, to protect the family they had built. Mark entered the kitchen quietly, his steps light, careful, as if he was still learning how to move in this new space they were creating together, this space where the shadows of doubt no longer dictated the rhythm of their days. He reached for Luna, lifting her into his arms with a practiced ease, her laughter ringing out as he kissed her cheek, the sound bright and clear, echoing through the house like a song, filling the corners that had once held only tension and silence. They ate breakfast together at the small table by the window, Luna's high chair pulled close, her small hands reaching for pieces of banana, her laughter filling the air as Mark made faces at her, her giggles the melody of a morning that felt simple, that felt real, that felt like the family Emily had fought for with every breath, with every tear, with every moment she refused to let go of the truth she knew in her bones. After breakfast, Emily dressed Luna in a soft yellow dress, brushing her curls back gently, clipping a small bow into her hair as Luna squirmed and giggled, her small hands patting Emily's face with a love so pure it left Emily blinking back tears. She lifted Luna, holding her close, pressing her cheek against the warmth of her daughter's hair, breathing in the scent that was uniquely hers, the scent that grounded Emily, that reminded her of why she had fought, why she had stayed, why she had chosen to build this family, not from the expectations of others, but from love, from truth, from the quiet, unshakable certainty of her heart. They stepped outside into the soft warmth of the morning, the air cool but gentle, the breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers, of wet earth, of a world waking up to the promise of a new day. Mark pushed the stroller as they walked down the quiet street, Luna watching the world with wide, curious eyes, her small hands gripping the edge of her blanket, her laughter ringing out as a dog barked from across the street, as the leaves rustled above them as the world moved around them with a quiet, steady rhythm. They passed neighbors who smiled, waving, commenting on how big Luna was getting, how beautiful her smile was, how bright her eyes were, each word sinking into Emily like small, quiet affirmations that this was real, that this was theirs, that the family they had built was enough, was whole, was exactly as it was meant to be. She watched Mark as he spoke to a neighbor, his smile easy, the lines of tension that had once marked his face slowly softening, his laughter genuine, his hand resting gently on Luna's stroller, a silent promise that he was here, that he was present, that he was choosing this, choosing them, every day. They returned home, the warmth of the morning still lingering on their skin, Luna drifting off to sleep in Emily's arms as they sat together on the couch, Mark's arm around her shoulders, his hand resting on Luna's small back, the three of them wrapped in the quiet, in the peace they had fought for, in the soft, steady promise of the family they had chosen to be. Later that afternoon, Emily found herself in the nursery, holding Luna as she slept, her small breaths warm against Emily's neck, her tiny hand curled around Emily's shirt, her body heavy with the complete trust of a child who knows she is loved, who knows she is safe, who knows she belongs. Emily rocked gently, the creak of the chair a quiet, familiar sound, her eyes moving over the room they had built together, the soft colors, the small crib, the mobile that turned slowly in the breeze from the open window, each piece a testament to the life they had created, to the love that filled every corner of their home. Mark stood in the doorway, watching them, his eyes soft, his expression open in a way that it hadn't been in months, the weight he had carried slowly lifting as he allowed himself to believe in the truth he had seen, in the love he felt, in the family that was his, that was theirs. He crossed the room, kneeling beside the chair, his hand resting on Emily's knee, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet, steady certainty that made her chest tighten, her breath catch, her heart expand with the love she felt for him, for their daughter, for the life they were building together. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice low, steady, a promise spoken into the soft light of the afternoon, a promise that settled around them, anchoring them in the truth of the moment. "I know," Emily whispered back, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining, the warmth of his touch grounding her, reminding her that they had made it through, that they were still here, that they were still choosing each other every day in every moment. They stayed like that, the three of them, wrapped in the quiet, in the soft light that streamed through the window, in the gentle rhythm of Luna's breathing, in the slow, steady beat of their hearts as they found a new rhythm, a new peace, a new beginning. In the days that followed, Emily found herself letting go the need for approval, for validation from those who could not see the truth she lived every day. She stopped checking her phone for messages that never came, stopped replaying conversations that no longer mattered, stopped allowing the shadows of the past to dictate the light of her present. She found peace in the small moments, in the laughter of her daughter, in the soft touch of Mark's hand on her back as they stood together, in the quiet, unspoken understanding that they had built something real, something unbreakable, something that was theirs. She began to see a therapist, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to understand the pieces of herself she had hidden away, the parts that had bent under the weight of others' expectations, the parts that had stayed quiet to keep the peace, the parts that had learned to shrink to fit into spaces too small for her truth. She began to reclaim those pieces, to stitch them back together with the love she felt for her daughter, with the quiet strength she found in the mornings when Luna's laughter filled the kitchen, with the peace she found in the evenings when Mark kissed her forehead before bed, whispering that he loved her, that he was grateful for her, that he was here. One afternoon, as the sun set in soft hues of pink and gold, Emily stood at the window, Luna on her hip, her small hand reaching for the light as it streamed through the glass, her laughter ringing out as the colors danced across the room. Emily pressed a kiss to her daughter's cheek, whispering softly, "You are loved. You are safe. You are ours." Mark joined them, wrapping his arms around Emily from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hand resting on Luna's back. The three of them standing together, watching the sunset, letting the quiet of the moment fill them with the certainty of who they were, of what they had, of what they would continue to build together. They were a family, not because of blood, not because of expectations, not because of the approval of others, but because they chose each other every day, in every moment, in every breath. They were a family because they loved, because they fought, because they forgave, because they healed, because they found each other again in the quiet after the storm. And in that quiet, in that soft, golden light, Emily knew they would be okay. She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, stronger, unbreakable, ready for the beautiful, messy, real life they were creating. One moment, one choice, one breath at a time. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other stories on the channel when you're ready for more. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. Thanks for watching.